Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Chapter 1. Death on Platform 3. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the platform at St. Mary Mead Station as Miss Jane Marple adjusted her handbag and glanced at the station clock. 4:15 precisely. The 4:17 to London would arrive momentarily, and she was rather looking forward to her visit with her great-nephew Raymond, though she suspected his invitation had more to do with his wife's absence than any genuine desire for her company. The station was busier than usual for a Tuesday afternoon. Mrs. Fletcher stood near the platform edge, her substantial figure draped in a navy wool coat that had seen better days, clutching a worn leather suitcase. She was catching the train to visit her sister in Paddington, as she had mentioned to Miss Marple earlier that morning outside the post office. The woman seemed unusually agitated, constantly checking her watch and peering down the track. Young Tom Bradley, the station porter, wheeled a trolley of parcels past Miss Marple with a polite nod. The boy couldn't be more than 25, with earnest brown eyes and a dedication to his work that Miss Marple found admirable. His mother had been unwell for months, she recalled, and the medical bills had been mounting. Such a burden for one so young. The sound of raised voices drew her attention to the station-master's office. Through the open door she could see Mr. Harold Pemberton, his face flushed with anger, gesticulating wildly at Mr. Blackwood, the ticket collector. Their argument seemed to concern overtime pay, though Miss Marple couldn't make out the exact words. Mr. Blackwood's weathered face was set in stubborn lines, his cap pushed back on his greying head. A distant whistle announced the approach of the London Express. Miss Marple gathered her belongings and moved toward the platform edge, noting how the various passengers and station staff positioned themselves for the train's arrival. It was rather like watching a well-rehearsed dance, each person knowing their part in the routine. The express thundered into the station with a great hiss of steam and screech of brakes. As the locomotive came to a halt, Miss Marple observed Mr. Pemberton emerge from his office, still red-faced from his altercation with Mr. Blackwood. The station-master walked briskly toward Platform 3, consulting his pocket watch with the practised eye of a man whose life was governed by precise timing. What happened next occurred so quickly that Miss Marple almost questioned whether she had seen it correctly. Mr. Pemberton had just reached the centre of Platform 3 when he suddenly staggered, his hand flying to his throat. His face contorted in what appeared to be pain or shock, and he began to fall forward. "Help!" cried Mrs. Fletcher, who had witnessed the collapse. "The station-master!" Tom Bradley dropped his trolley and rushed to Pemberton's side, while Mr. Blackwood emerged from behind a pillar where he had been checking tickets. Miss Marple hurried forward as well, her knitting bag swinging at her side. Mr. Pemberton lay writhing on the platform, his breathing laboured and his face taking on an alarming bluish tinge. His fingers clutched convulsively at something in his waistcoat pocket, and Miss Marple noticed that his pocket watch had come loose, its chain tangled around his fingers. "Fetch Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple instructed Tom Bradley quietly. "And quickly!" The young porter ran toward the station entrance while Miss Marple knelt beside the stricken man. There was something about his condition that troubled her. The sudden onset, the way his breathing had become so distressed, the peculiar colour of his complexion. It reminded her of something she had read about in one of her detective novels, though she couldn't quite place what. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand. He examined Mr. Pemberton with professional efficiency, but Miss Marple could see from his expression that there was little to be done. The station-master's struggles were growing weaker, and his eyes had taken on a glassy appearance. "Is there nothing you can do, Doctor?" Mrs. Fletcher asked anxiously. Dr. Haydock shook his head grimly. "I'm afraid not. He's gone." As the doctor rose from his examination, Miss Marple noticed him pause and sniff the air around the deceased man. His expression became troubled, and he bent down again, this time bringing his nose closer to Mr. Pemberton's lips. "What is it, Doctor?" Miss Marple inquired. "There's a smell," Dr. Haydock said quietly. "Rather like bitter almonds. Most peculiar." Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze. Bitter almonds. She had indeed read about that particular odour in her detective stories, and it never boded well for the victim. "Heart attack, was it?" Mr. Blackwood asked, removing his cap respectfully. "I'm not certain," Dr. Haydock replied carefully. "There will need to be an examination." Miss Marple observed the small crowd that had gathered around the scene. The passengers from the London train had descended and were now clustered at a respectful distance, their journey delayed by this unexpected tragedy. Mrs. Fletcher had grown quite pale and was fanning herself with her handkerchief. Tom Bradley stood with his cap in his hands, looking shocked and confused. Inspector Slack arrived just as Dr. Haydock was preparing to have the body moved. The inspector was a man of medium height with a tendency towards self-importance, and he surveyed the scene with the air of one who had seen everything before. "Natural death, I suppose?" he inquired of the doctor. "That remains to be determined, Doctor," Haydock replied. "I'll need to conduct a proper examination." Miss Marple watched as Inspector Slack began his preliminary investigation. He questioned the witnesses perfunctorily, making notes in his small book. When he came to examine Mr. Pemberton's effects, he found the pocket watch still clutched in the dead man's fingers, its hands frozen at exactly 4:17. "Stopped at the moment of death," the inspector observed. "Curious how that happens sometimes." But Miss Marple noticed something else that seemed to escape the inspector's attention. Protruding from Mr. Pemberton's other hand was a folded railway timetable, and she could see that certain departure times had been circled in red ink. The markings seemed deliberate, not random, as if they held some particular significance. "Inspector," she said quietly, "you might want to examine that timetable more closely." Inspector Slack looked at her with barely concealed irritation. "Miss Marple, I'm sure you mean well, but this appears to be a straightforward case of heart failure. These things happen to men of Mr. Pemberton's age and temperament." "Nevertheless," Miss Marple persisted gently, "the timetable might tell us something about his state of mind in his final moments." The inspector sighed, but carefully extracted the paper from the dead man's grip. As he unfolded it, Miss Marple could see that several train times had indeed been marked in red ink, creating a pattern that seemed purposeful rather than accidental. "Probably just doing his job," Inspector Slack muttered, but he pocketed the timetable nonetheless. As the body was finally removed and the platform began to clear, Miss Marple lingered, studying the spot where Mr. Pemberton had fallen. There was something about the timing of his collapse that troubled her. He had emerged from his office immediately after his argument with Mr. Blackwood, had walked directly to platform 3, and had collapsed just as the express train arrived. The precision of it all seemed almost choreographed. Tom Bradley approached her as she stood in contemplation. "Terrible thing, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "Mr. Pemberton wasn't well liked, but nobody deserves to die like that." "What do you mean by not well liked, Tom?" The young man glanced around nervously. "Oh, just that he'd been having troubles lately. Arguments with the staff, complaints from passengers. He'd been receiving some letters that upset him greatly." "What sort of letters?" "I don't rightly know, miss. But I heard him on the telephone yesterday talking to someone about irregularities and inspections. He seemed quite agitated about it." Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. Irregularity was beginning to seem far more complex than a simple heart attack. As she finally boarded a later train to London, Miss Marple found herself wondering about the significance of those circled times on the railway timetable. In her experience, when a man died clutching evidence of his daily work, that evidence usually held the key to understanding his death. The question was whether Inspector Slack would prove perceptive enough to recognise the importance of what he had found. or whether it would fall to her to unravel the mystery of Mr. Pemberton's peculiar demise. The train pulled away from St. Mary Mead Station, and Miss Marple settled back in her seat, her mind already working through the various possibilities. She had a feeling that this case would prove to be far more intricate than it appeared on the surface, and that before it was resolved, several more secrets would come to light about the seemingly routine operations of their small village railway station. Chapter 2. The Impossible Timetable. Miss Marple's journey to London proved most unsatisfactory. Despite her best efforts to concentrate on the countryside rolling past her window, her mind kept returning to the peculiar circumstances of Mr. Pemberton's death. The smell of bitter almonds that Dr. Haydock had detected, the railway timetable clutched in the dead man's hand, and the precise timing of his collapse all suggested something far more sinister than natural causes. She cut short her visit with Raymond, claiming a sudden headache, and returned to St. Mary Mead on the evening train. Her great-nephew seemed rather relieved, if truth be told, and Miss Marple suspected he had already made plans that didn't include entertaining an elderly aunt. The next morning brought disturbing confirmation of her suspicions. Dr. Haydock called upon her just after breakfast, his usually cheerful demeanour replaced by grave concern. "I've completed my examination of poor Pemberton," he announced without preamble as he settled into her sitting-room chair. "I'm afraid my initial suspicions were correct. The man was poisoned." "Cyanide?" Miss Marple inquired, setting down her teacup. "Indeed. A fairly substantial dose, I'd say. Enough to kill him within minutes of ingestion." Dr. Haydock shook his head sadly. "The question is how and when it was administered." "And by whom?" Miss Marple added quietly. "Quite so. I've informed Inspector Slack, naturally, though I suspect he's not entirely pleased with this development. He was rather hoping for a straightforward heart attack." Miss Marple rose and moved to her writing desk, where she had placed the evening newspaper from the previous day. "Doctor, I wonder if you might help me with something. I've been puzzling over that railway timetable that was found with Mr. Pemberton." She produced a copy of the official railway schedule, which she had obtained from Tom Bradley that morning. "I asked young Tom to provide me with the current timetable, and I've been comparing it with my recollections of the markings on the one found with the deceased." Dr. Haydock joined her at the desk, peering over her shoulder as she pointed to various entries. "You see here, Doctor? The 4:17 to London, which was the train I intended to catch yesterday." But according to Tom, Mr. Pemberton had circled several other times as well. Times that seem rather odd. "How so?" "Well, there was a marking at 4:03 and another at 4:24, but according to this official schedule, there are no trains departing St. Mary Mead at those times. The afternoon service consists of the 3:47 local, the 4:17 express, and then nothing until the 5:30 stopping train." Dr. Haydock frowned. Perhaps he was noting connecting times from other stations. "That's what I thought initially, but Tom mentioned something curious when I spoke with him this morning. He said that over the past few weeks he'd noticed trains arriving and departing that didn't seem to match the posted schedule. He assumed there had been temporary changes due to track work or some such thing, but when he asked Mr. Pemberton about it, he was told rather sharply to mind his own business. The implications of this revelation hung heavy in the morning air. Miss Marple continued her examination of the timetable, her finger tracing the various entries. "If trains have been running on an unofficial schedule," she mused, "it would create gaps in the official record, periods of time when, according to the documents, nothing should be happening at the station. 7-minute gaps, you might say," Dr. Haydock observed, noting the pattern of the circled times. "Precisely. And if Mr. Pemberton died at exactly 4:17, according to his stopped watch, but the poison was administered 7 minutes earlier, then the murder occurred during one of these phantom time periods," Dr. Haydock completed her thought. "Most ingenious, if true." Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who appeared at Miss Marple's door in a state of considerable agitation. His usually neat appearance was somewhat dishevelled, and he carried a leather portfolio under his arm. "Miss Marple, Doctor," Haydock, he greeted them tersely, "I'm glad to find you both here. We've had some rather disturbing developments in the Pemberton case." He opened his portfolio and withdrew several sheets of paper. "I've been conducting interviews with the witnesses from yesterday, and their stories don't add up. Not at all." "In what way, Inspector?" Miss Marple inquired. "Well, take Mrs. Fletcher, for instance. She claims she was waiting on platform 2 for the 4:17 train, which matches what you told me, Miss Marple. But when I pressed her for details about her movements before the train arrived, she mentioned seeing a train depart at 4:10, a train that, according to the official schedule, doesn't exist." Dr. Haydock and Miss Marple exchanged meaningful glances. "And there's more," Inspector Slack continued. "Mr. Blackwood, the ticket collector, insists that he checked tickets on a 4:03 departure, but again, no such train appears on the official timetable. When I confronted him with this discrepancy, he became quite defensive and claimed there had been special services that weren't widely publicised." "Special services?" Miss Marple repeated. "That's what he said. Claimed they were temporary measures to accommodate extra freight or passenger demand. But when I contacted the railway authorities in London, they had no record of any special services operating through St. Mary Mead." Inspector Slack spread the papers on Miss Marple's tea table. "I've also discovered something else troubling. Young Tom Bradley mentioned that Mr. Pemberton had been receiving threatening letters. I searched the station master's office this morning and found several of them." He produced a handful of envelopes, each bearing the same neat handwriting. "They're all anonymous, but they make reference to irregularities in the train schedules and threaten to expose what they call unauthorised activities." Miss Marple examined one of the letters carefully. The paper was of good quality, the handwriting educated and precise. "This suggests that someone was aware of these phantom train runs and was using that knowledge to pressure Mr. Pemberton." "My thoughts exactly," Inspector Slack agreed. "But here's the puzzling part. According to his appointment diary, Pemberton had scheduled a meeting with railway inspectors for today. It appears he was planning to report something to the authorities himself." "Perhaps he had grown tired of being blackmailed," Dr. Haydock suggested. "Or perhaps he had discovered something that frightened him sufficiently to seek official protection," Miss Marple added thoughtfully. Inspector Slack gathered up his papers. "There's something else that's been bothering me. The station clock. I've been comparing it with my watch and with the church clock, and it's running 7 minutes slow. Tom Bradley says it's been that way for weeks, but no one bothered to have it corrected." Miss Marple felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to align in her mind. "Inspector, this could be quite significant. If the station clock is 7 minutes slow, it would create confusion about the actual timing of events. Someone could use this discrepancy to their advantage." "How so?" "Well, consider this scenario. The official timetable shows the 4:17 express as the only afternoon departure. But if someone were running unauthorised trains 7 minutes before the scheduled times, they could claim those trains departed at, say, 4:10 according to the station clock, when they actually departed at 4:17 according to real time." Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. "Creating a window of time that officially doesn't exist, but during which actual activities could take place." "Precisely. And if witnesses base their statements on the station clock rather than accurate time, they would unknowingly provide false alibis for activities occurring during these phantom periods." Inspector Slack looked troubled. "You're suggesting that someone has been deliberately manipulating the train schedules and the station clock to create opportunities for illegal activities?" "It would appear so," Miss Marple replied, and each considering the implications of their discoveries. Finally, Inspector Slack spoke. "I'll need to conduct more thorough interviews with all the railway staff, and I'll have to examine the station's records more carefully. If there really have been unauthorised train movements, there should be some trace of them in the operational logs. You might also want to investigate the financial circumstances of the various staff members," Miss Marple suggested gently. "If someone has been profiting from illegal activities, there may be evidence of unexplained income or improved living standards." After Inspector Slack departed, Miss Marple and Dr. Haydock continued their discussion of the case. The doctor seemed particularly intrigued by the precision of the timing involved. The administration of the poison, he mused, would have required very careful calculation. Cyanide works quickly, but not instantaneously. The killer would have needed to ensure that Pemberton received the poison at exactly the right moment for him to collapse when he did, which suggests someone with intimate knowledge of his daily routines and the station's operations, Miss Marple observed. Mr. Pemberton was clearly a man of habit. His collapse at precisely 4:17, just as the express arrived, was no coincidence. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple found herself drawn repeatedly to her window, which offered a partial view of the railway station. She watched as the various trains arrived and departed, noting the activities of the staff and passengers. There was something almost choreographed about the routine, as if everyone knew their role in an elaborate performance. But now she suspected that some of the performers had been playing parts in a very different drama, one that had ultimately led to murder. The 7-minute gaps in the official timetable had created a window of opportunity that someone had exploited for their own purposes, and when Mr. Pemberton had threatened to close that window, he had signed his own death warrant. The question now was which member of the station's small community had possessed both the knowledge and the ruthlessness necessary to commit such a precisely timed murder. Miss Marple had a feeling that before this case was resolved, several more secrets about the seemingly routine operations of St. Mary Mead Station would come to light. Chapter 3: Secrets in the Station Master's Office. 2 days after Mr. Pemberton's funeral, Miss Marple found herself walking past the railway station during her morning constitutional. The building seemed oddly quiet without its authoritative station master, and she noticed that Tom Bradley was attempting to manage both his porter duties and the basic administrative tasks that kept the station functioning. Inspector Slack emerged from the station office just as she approached, looking considerably more harried than usual. His investigation had clearly not proceeded as smoothly as he had hoped. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a mixture of resignation and hope, "perhaps you might be able to make sense of what I've discovered in Pemberton's office. The man's record-keeping was far more complex than one might expect for a small village station." Miss Marple followed him into the cramped office behind the ticket counter. The space was dominated by a large oak desk covered with ledgers, correspondence, and railway documents. Filing cabinets lined one wall, and a safe stood open in the corner, its contents scattered across a nearby table. "I've been through everything twice," Inspector Slack explained, "and I keep finding discrepancies that don't make sense. Look at this." He opened one of the ledgers and pointed to a series of entries written in Pemberton's precise handwriting. "These appear to be records of train movements, but they don't match the official schedule we obtained from London. There are entries for trains departing at times when no trains should have been running." Miss Marple examined the ledger carefully. The entries were methodical and detailed, noting not only departure times but also cargo descriptions and what appeared to be financial figures. "This suggests a very systematic operation," she observed, "not the sort of thing one would expect if these were merely scheduling errors." "That's what troubles me," Inspector Slack agreed. "And there's more." He opened a second ledger, this one bound in green leather. "This appears to be some sort of parallel accounting system. Look at these entries." The green ledger contained records of payments received for what were described as special services. The amounts were substantial, far exceeding what one might expect from normal railway operations at a small station like St. Mary Mead. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I believe Mr. Pemberton was keeping 2 sets of books, one for official railway business and another for something considerably less legitimate." "My thoughts exactly. But what sort of illegal activity could generate this kind of income at a railway station?" Miss Marple moved to examine the contents of the safe, which Inspector Slack had arranged on the table. Among the usual documents and a small amount of cash, she found several photographs that seemed oddly out of place in a station master's office. "Inspector, what do you make of these?" She held up the photographs, which showed the station platform at various times, apparently taken from the office window. What made them significant was that they captured images of people and activities that didn't correspond to the scheduled train times. "I hadn't paid much attention to those," Inspector Slack admitted. "I assumed they were just pictures he'd taken for some personal reason." "Look more closely at the timestamps," Miss Marple suggested. This photograph shows a train at the platform with several people loading what appear to be crates. The timestamp reads 4:10 p.m. last Tuesday, but according to the official schedule there was no train at that time. Inspector Slack studied the photograph with renewed interest. "You're right, and look at this figure in the background. Isn't that Mrs. Fletcher?" Miss Marple examined the image more carefully. Indeed, the woman in the photograph bore a strong resemblance to Mrs. Fletcher, though she appeared to be engaged in activities quite different from simply waiting for a passenger train. "There are more photographs," she noted, spreading them across the desk, "and they all seem to document these phantom train operations. Mr. Pemberton was creating a record of whatever was happening during those 7-minute gaps in the official timetable." "Evidence," Inspector Slack said grimly. He was gathering evidence. "Or perhaps insurance," Miss Marple suggested. "If he was involved in whatever scheme was operating, he may have wanted proof of other people's participation to protect himself." Their examination was interrupted by the arrival of Tom Bradley, who appeared in the doorway looking anxious and uncomfortable. "Inspector," he began hesitantly, "I hope you don't mind, but I need to retrieve some of the operational logs. The replacement station master from London is arriving this afternoon, and he'll need to review the recent records." "Of course, Tom," Inspector Slack replied. "But tell me, have you noticed anything unusual about Mr. Pemberton's record-keeping in recent weeks?" The young porter shifted nervously. "Well, sir, he'd been working very long hours, often stayed late into the evening, going through papers and making telephone calls, and he'd been receiving a lot more mail than usual." "What sort of mail?" "Official-looking letters, mostly. Some from London, but others with local postmarks. He seemed quite agitated about many of them." Tom paused, then added reluctantly, "And there were visitors. People who didn't seem like ordinary railway business." Miss Marple looked up from the photographs. "What sort of visitors, Tom?" "Well, there was Mr. Morrison, the conductor on the London run. He'd been coming by quite often, usually in the evenings after his shift. And Mrs. Fletcher had several meetings with Mr. Pemberton over the past month. She said it was about shipping arrangements for her sister's business, but—" He trailed off uncertainly. "But," Inspector Slack prompted, "it just seemed odd, sir. Mrs. Fletcher's sister runs a small boarding house in Paddington. What would she need with regular shipping arrangements?" Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged glances. The web of connections was becoming clearer, and it appeared that several members of the local community had been involved in whatever scheme Mr. Pemberton had been operating. After Tom Bradley departed with the operational logs he needed, Miss Marple continued her examination of the office. In a drawer of the filing cabinet, she discovered a folder marked Irregularities that contained copies of correspondence with railway authorities in London. "Inspector," she called, "you should see this." The folder contained Pemberton's own reports to his superiors about discrepancies in the train schedules and unexplained cargo movements. The letters were dated over the past 3 months and showed a pattern of growing concern about unauthorised activities at various stations along the line. He was reporting problems to London, Inspector Slack observed, but according to his appointment diary, he was also planning to meet with railway inspectors about the situation at conspirators. At the bottom of the folder she found a handwritten note in Pemberton's distinctive script. "Can no longer continue. Too dangerous. Must stop before someone gets hurt." This was written just 2 days before his death, Inspector Slack noted, checking the date. It seems he had decided to end his involvement in whatever was happening here. Miss Marple sat back in Pemberton's chair, trying to piece together the sequence of events. It appears that Mr. Pemberton was both participant and victim in this affair. He helped create and operate the system of phantom trains, but when the operation became too risky or when pressure from London became too intense, he decided to expose it. "And someone killed him to prevent that exposure," Inspector Slack concluded. "The question is who had the most to lose if the operation were revealed." Miss Marple rose and moved to the window that overlooked the platform. Someone with intimate knowledge of the station's operations, someone who knew Pemberton's routines, and someone who had access to the chemicals needed to create the poison. She watched as the afternoon express pulled into the station, noting how efficiently the remaining staff managed the arrival and departure, despite the absence of their station master. The routine was so well established that it functioned almost automatically. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe we need to examine the financial circumstances of everyone connected with the station. If this operation was as profitable as these ledgers suggest, there should be evidence of where that money went." "I've already begun looking into that," Inspector Slack replied. "Tom Bradley's mother has been receiving expensive medical treatment that should be well beyond a porter's salary. Mrs. Fletcher has recently paid off significant debts on her property, and Mr. Blackwood has been making improvements to his cottage that seem inconsistent with a ticket collector's wages. All of which suggests that the profits from this phantom train operation were being shared among the participants," Miss Marple observed. "But if Mr. Pemberton was planning to expose them all, each of them would have had motive for murder." As they prepared to leave the office, Miss Marple noticed one final detail that had escaped their earlier attention. Pinned to a small corkboard beside the desk was a railway worker's schedule, and someone had made small pencil marks next to certain names and times. "Inspector, look at this," she said, pointing to the schedule. "These marks correspond to the phantom train times we've identified. It appears Mr. Pemberton was tracking which employees were involved in the unauthorised operations. The implications were clear. Mr. Pemberton had not only been documenting the illegal activities, but had also been identifying the specific individuals responsible for carrying them out. Such information would have been devastating if revealed to the authorities, providing more than sufficient motive for murder." As they locked the office and prepared to leave, Miss Marple reflected on how much they had learned and how much remained mysterious. The phantom trains, the financial irregularities, and the network of conspirators were becoming clearer, but the identity of Mr. Pemberton's killer remained elusive. What was certain was that the murderer was someone very close to the station's operations, someone who had intimate knowledge of both the illegal scheme and the station master's personal habits. The 7-minute window that made the crime possible was also the key to understanding the broader conspiracy that had ultimately led to murder. Chapter 4: The Conductor's Final Journey. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage. Mr. James Morrison, the conductor from the London Express, stood at her garden gate looking considerably worse for wear than when she had occasionally seen him in his official capacity. His usually neat uniform was rumpled, his face unshaven, and his hands trembled slightly as he removed his cap. "Miss Marple," he began hesitantly, "I wonder if I might have a word with you about Mr. Pemberton's death." Miss Marple invited him into her sitting room, noting his obvious distress. She had learned over the years that people in such states often revealed far more than they intended, and Mr. Morrison's agitation suggested he had considerable information to share. "I understand you've been speaking with Inspector Slack," she said gently, settling him into a comfortable chair and offering tea. "This must be a very difficult time for you." Morrison accepted the tea gratefully, his hand still shaking as he lifted the cup. "It is, miss. More difficult than you might imagine. You see, I knew Harold Pemberton better than most people realised. We'd been working together on certain matters." "What sort of matters, Mr. Morrison?" The conductor glanced around nervously as if expecting to be overheard. "I suppose there's no point in hiding it any more. We'd been running special trains through St. Mary Mead, trains that weren't on the official schedule." Miss Marple maintained an expression of polite interest while mentally noting this confirmation of their suspicions. "How long had this been going on?" "About 6 months, Morrison replied. "It started small, just occasional runs to accommodate extra freight, or passengers who needed to travel without official documentation. Harold said it was a way to help people while earning a bit extra for the station." "And you believed that was all it was?" Morrison's expression grew troubled. "At first, yes, but gradually the cargo became more questionable. Unmarked crates, packages that people were very secretive about, and the payments were far too generous for simple transportation services." Miss Marple refilled his teacup. "When did you begin to suspect that something more serious was involved?" "About 2 months ago," Morrison admitted. "I was asked to transport a shipment that I was specifically told not to inspect or question. The people involved were unpleasant sorts, not the kind of passengers or freight customers we normally dealt with. Did you discuss your concerns with Mr. Pemberton? I tried to, miss, but Harold had changed over the past few months. He'd become secretive, suspicious of everyone. When I mentioned my worries about the nature of our cargo, he told me it was better not to ask questions, said we were all making good money and that should be enough. Morrison paused to sip his tea, gathering his thoughts. But then, about 3 weeks ago, everything changed. Harold received a visit from some men from London. Railway inspectors, they claimed to be, though they didn't look like any inspectors I'd ever seen. What made you suspicious of them? Their questions were too specific, too detailed about our special operations, and Harold was terrified after they left. He spent the rest of that day going through his files, making telephone calls, acting like a man who'd received very bad news. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Did he confide in you about what the visitors had told him? Not directly, but I overheard part of a telephone conversation he had that evening. He was talking to someone about ending the arrangement and going to the authorities. He kept saying that things had gone too far and that he wouldn't be part of it anymore. This aligned perfectly with the evidence they had found in Pemberton's office, Miss Marple reflected. The station master had indeed been planning to expose the operation. Mr. Morrison, she said carefully, do you know who else was involved in these special train runs? The conductor's face grew even more troubled. That's the difficult part, miss. It wasn't just Harold and me. Mrs. Fletcher had been using our services regularly, shipping packages for what she claimed was her sister's business. Mr. Blackwood was involved too, arranging for the trains to pass through without proper documentation. And young Tom Bradley, well, he loaded and unloaded cargo without asking questions. A conspiracy involving the entire station staff, Miss Marple observed. It seemed so at the time, Morrison agreed. But I've been thinking about it since Harold's death, and I'm not sure everyone knew the full extent of what was happening. Tom, for instance, might have thought he was just helping with legitimate but unofficial railway business. What about the morning of Mr. Pemberton's death? Did you see him that day? Morrison nodded grimly. I had an argument with him that morning, miss. A terrible argument that I now regret deeply. He'd told me the night before that he was planning to end our arrangement, and I went to the station early to try to change his mind. Why were you so concerned about ending the arrangement? The money, miss. I'll be honest about that. My wife has been ill for over a year, and the medical expenses have been enormous. The extra income from the special runs was the only thing keeping us afloat financially. Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy for the man's situation. Financial desperation had clearly driven several people into this web of illegal activity. What exactly was said during your argument with Mr. Pemberton? Morrison's hands clenched around his teacup. Ideas that went far beyond simple smuggling. What sort of criminal activities? He wouldn't give me details, but he mentioned stolen goods, illegal immigrants, even weapons. He said some of the cargo we'd been transporting was connected to serious crimes, and that he could no longer be part of it. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. The phantom train operation had apparently escalated far beyond its original scope, involving increasingly serious criminal activities that had ultimately frightened Pemberton into seeking official protection. When did your argument with Mr. Pemberton end? About 3:30 that afternoon. I had to prepare for the regular London run, and Harold said he had work to do in his office. He was very agitated, kept checking his watch and muttering about having to set things right. And that was the last time you saw him alive? Morrison nodded sadly. I was in the locomotive when the London Express pulled into the station. I saw the commotion on the platform but didn't realise what had happened until later. By the time I learned Harold was dead, the train had already departed for London. Miss Marple considered the timeline Morrison had provided. His argument with Pemberton had ended at 3:30, and the station master had died at 4:17. That left nearly an hour during which someone could have administered the poison that killed him. Mr. Morrison, she said gently, do you have any idea who might have wanted to harm Mr. Pemberton? Someone who would have been threatened by his plan to expose the operation? The conductor was quiet for a long moment, staring into his teacup. I've been thinking about that constantly since his death, he finally said. Any of us could have been ruined if Harold had gone to the authorities. But murder? I never imagined any of us capable of that. Sometimes people do things they never thought possible when they feel cornered, Miss Marple observed, particularly when they have access to the means and opportunity. Morrison looked up sharply. You mean the chemicals? Yes. I suppose any of us could have obtained cyanide from the railway maintenance supplies. We use various compounds for cleaning and treating metal components. This was the first confirmation Miss Marple had received about the source of the poison. Are these chemicals readily accessible to the station staff? Unfortunately, yes. Harold was always after us to be more careful about security, but the storage areas were rarely locked. Anyone familiar with the station could have accessed them. As Morrison prepared to leave, Miss Marple asked one final question. Do you believe Mr. Pemberton's death will end the Phantom train operations? The conductor's expression was grim. I think it already has, miss. Word has gotten around about the investigation, and none of us are eager to continue without Harold's coordination. Besides, the authorities will be watching the station much more carefully now. After Morrison departed, Miss Marple sat in her garden, reviewing what she had learned. The conductor's testimony had provided crucial details about the scope of the criminal operation and the timeline of the events leading to Pemberton's death. It had also confirmed that multiple people had both motive and opportunity for murder. The Phantom trains had clearly evolved from a relatively harmless scheme to supplement income into something far more serious and dangerous. When Pemberton had finally decided to expose the operation, he had signed his own death warrant. The question now which of his co-conspirators had possessed both the desperation and the ruthlessness necessary to commit murder. Miss Marple had a growing suspicion about the identity of the killer, but she would need more evidence before she could be certain. The 7-minute window that had made the crime possible was also the key to determining who had been in the right place at the right time to administer the fatal dose of cyanide. The truth, she felt certain, lay somewhere in the precise timing that had made this seemingly perfect murder possible. Chapter 5. Murder Most Punctual. Miss Marple spent the next morning in careful contemplation of the evidence that had emerged. The more she considered the circumstances of Mr. Pemberton's death, the more convinced she became that the timing had been absolutely critical to the murderer's plan. She sat in her garden with a cup of tea and her notebook, sketching out a timeline of events from the fatal afternoon. At precisely 11 o'clock, Inspector Slack arrived, looking both frustrated and oddly triumphant. He carried a manila folder and wore the expression of a man who had discovered something significant, but wasn't entirely certain what to make of it. Miss Marple, he announced, settling himself heavily in her garden chair, I've made some discoveries that I think you'll find most interesting. It concerns the timing of Pemberton's death and certain discrepancies in the witness statements. Miss Marple set aside her notebook with interest. What sort of discrepancies, Inspector? Well, to begin with, I've had the station clock examined by a clockmaker from the next village. You were quite right about it running 7 minutes slow, but here's the curious part. The mechanism shows signs of deliberate tampering. Someone adjusted it to run slow and fairly recently too. How recently? Within the past month, according to the clockmaker. The adjustment was made by someone who knew what they were doing, not a casual bit of mischief. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. So the slow clock was part of the deception, not merely a convenient coincidence. Exactly, but there's more. Inspector Slack opened his folder and withdrew several sheets of paper. I've been re-interviewing all the witnesses about their exact movements and observations on the afternoon of the murder. When I pressed them for very specific details about timing, their stories began to fall apart. He consulted his notes. Mrs. Fletcher, for instance, initially claimed she was waiting for the 4:17 train and saw Pemberton collapse just as it arrived. But when I asked her to account for every minute of her time on the platform, she admitted to seeing what she thought was an earlier train departure at 4:10 according to the station clock. Which would have been 4:17 in real time, Miss Marple observed. Precisely, and here's where it becomes interesting. She claimed she was on the platform continuously from 4 o'clock onward. but Tom Bradley says he saw her near the station office at around 4:05 station time, which would be 4:12 in real time. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. So there's a gap in her account of her movements. Indeed, and Tom Bradley's story has inconsistencies as well. He claims he was loading freight onto a trolley during the crucial period, but the freight manifest shows no delivery scheduled for that time. When I pressed him, he admitted the freight was for one of the special trains that Morrison told you about. Inspector Slack turned to another page of his notes. But here's the most significant discovery. I found Pemberton's pocket watch in the evidence locker and had it examined by the same clockmaker. The watch hadn't simply stopped at 4:17 due to his death. It had been deliberately stopped at that time. Deliberately stopped, Miss Marple repeated with considerable interest. The mechanism shows clear signs of tampering. Someone pressed the crown in a specific way to stop the movement while leaving the watch appearing to run normally. It's an old trick used by people who want to create false evidence about timing. Miss Marple felt several pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. So the killer not only used the confusion created by the slow station clock, but also manipulated Pemberton's watch to support a false timeline. That's my conclusion. The real question is who had the knowledge and opportunity to manipulate both timepieces. Inspector Slack consulted his notes again. I've also discovered something troubling about the threatening letters found in Pemberton's office. I had the paper analysed, and it matches stationery sold exclusively at Fletcher's shop in the village. Mrs. Fletcher's shop, the very same, which means either she wrote the threatening letters herself or someone wanted us to think she did. Miss Marple considered this development carefully. If Mrs. Fletcher wrote those letters, it suggests she was trying to pressure Mr. Pemberton about something, but if someone else used her stationery, it could be an attempt to implicate her in the murder, Inspector Slack completed her thought. I'm beginning to think this entire affair was planned much more carefully than I initially realised. They were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, who appeared at the garden gate looking unusually grave. Inspector, Miss Marple, he greeted them. I've completed some additional analysis of the poison that killed Pemberton, and I think you should know what I've discovered. He joined them at the garden table, declining Miss Marple's offer of tea. The cyanide compound found in Pemberton's system was not the crude industrial variety one might expect from railway maintenance supplies. It was a much more refined preparation, suggesting someone with considerable chemical knowledge. What sort of knowledge, Inspector Slack? Precisely. Miss Marple felt a chill of recognition. Doctor, would this level of chemical knowledge be consistent with someone who had, perhaps, worked in a pharmacy or medical facility? Absolutely. In fact, the preparation suggests someone quite familiar with medicinal compounds and their effects. Inspector Slack looked puzzled. But none of our suspects has that kind of background. Tom Bradley is a railway porter, Morrison's a train conductor, Mrs. Fletcher runs a small shop, and Blackwood is a ticket collector. Perhaps we need to look more carefully at their backgrounds, Miss Marple suggested gently. People often have skills and experiences that aren't immediately obvious. Dr. Haydock nodded in agreement. There's something else you should know. Based on the concentration of poison in Pemberton's system and the timing of his collapse, I can now determine very precisely when the cyanide was administered. When? Both Miss Marple and Inspector Slack asked simultaneously. Approximately 7 minutes before his collapse, which means the poison was given to him at exactly 4:10, according to the station clock, or 4:17 in real time. Miss Marple felt the final piece of the timing puzzle fall into place. So the murder occurred during one of the phantom train periods, when the confusion about schedules would provide perfect cover for the killer's movements. And, Inspector Slack added grimly, it means the killer timed the administration of the poison to coincide precisely with the arrival of the London Express, knowing that Pemberton would collapse just as the train pulled in, creating maximum confusion and distraction. Dr. Haydock gathered his papers. There's one more thing. The poison was almost certainly administered in liquid form, probably mixed with something Pemberton drank. Given the bitter taste of cyanide, it would have needed to be disguised in something with a strong flavour. After the doctor departed, Miss Marple and Inspector Slack sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. The evidence was beginning to form a coherent picture, but the identity of the killer remained elusive. "Inspector," Miss Marple said finally, "I believe we need to focus on the 7-minute window when the crime was committed. Who had the opportunity to be alone with Mr. Pemberton during that precise period? And who had access to something he would drink without suspicion?" Inspector Slack consulted his notes again. According to the witness statements, Tom Bradley was moving freight near the station office around that time. Mrs. Fletcher claims she was on the platform but admits to a gap in her account. Morrison was preparing the London Express for departure, and Blackwood was checking tickets somewhere in the station. All of them had opportunity, Miss Marple observed, but the question is which one had the specific knowledge needed to prepare the poison and manipulate the timepieces. As Inspector Slack prepared to leave, Miss Marple made one final observation. "Inspector, I think we should pay particular attention to anyone who might have had reason to visit Mr. Pemberton's office during the crucial period. The poison was administered in a drink, which suggests someone who had legitimate access to his private space." "You're thinking of the tea service he kept in his office?" "Precisely. Mr. Pemberton was known to be very particular about his afternoon tea. Someone who knew his habits could have easily poisoned his cup during the 7-minute window when the phantom train was providing cover." The inspector nodded thoughtfully. "I'll review the statements again, focusing on who might have had access to his office during that specific time period." As Miss Marple watched him depart, she reflected on how the precision of the timing had been both the killer's greatest advantage and their potential downfall. The 7-minute window that had made the perfect crime possible had also created a very narrow time frame in which the murder could have been committed. Someone had planned this crime with extraordinary care, but Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that their very precision might ultimately prove to be their undoing. Chapter 6. The Missing 7 Minutes. Miss Marple had always found that the most revealing moments in an investigation came not from dramatic discoveries, but from quiet reflection on seemingly insignificant details. As she sat in her sitting room the following evening reviewing her notes from the past week, she found herself returning repeatedly to the question of those 7 missing minutes that had made the crime possible. The phantom trains had clearly been operating for months, creating windows of time that officially didn't exist, but during which very real activities were taking place. Someone had invested considerable effort in establishing this system, and Miss Marple suspected that Mr. Pemberton's murder was only the most recent and desperate act in a much larger scheme. Her contemplation was interrupted by a gentle tap at her door. She opened it to find Tom Bradley standing on her doorstep, his cap in his hands and his expression deeply troubled. "Miss Marple," he said hesitantly, "I hope you don't mind me calling so late, but I've been thinking about Mr. Pemberton's death, and there are things I need to tell someone. Things I should have mentioned to Inspector Slack, but didn't." Miss Marple invited him in and settled him in her sitting room with a cup of tea. The young man's distress was evident, and she suspected he carried information that had been weighing heavily on his conscience. "What sort of things, Tom?" she asked gently. "Well, miss, it's about those special trains that everyone's been talking about. They weren't just carrying smuggled goods or helping people travel without papers. There were other things, worse things, that I didn't understand at the time." Tom took a shaky sip of his tea before continuing. "About a month ago I was asked to help load some crates onto one of the phantom trains. Heavy crates they were, and the men supervising the loading were very particular about how they were handled. They said the contents were fragile and valuable." "What made you suspicious about these crates?" "It was the weight, miss. They were much heavier than you'd expect for their size, and they were marked with symbols I didn't recognise. Foreign symbols, I think. And the men handling them, well, they weren't the usual sort of people we dealt with." Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "Can you describe these men?" "Hard-looking fellows, miss. Well-dressed, but with a roughness about them that made me uncomfortable. They spoke with accents I couldn't place, and they seemed to know exactly what they were doing. This wasn't their first time using our services." Tom set down his teacup with trembling hands. "But here's what really troubles me, miss. Last week I overheard Mr. Pemberton talking on the telephone about those same crates. He was very agitated, saying something about weapons and how he never agreed to transport anything dangerous. Weapons? Miss Marple repeated with concern. That's what it sounded like, miss. He kept saying he thought it was just smuggled goods, maybe some stolen property, but nothing that could hurt people. He seemed frightened by what he'd discovered. This revelation cast the entire Phantom train operation in a much more sinister light. If weapons were being transported through St. Mary Mead, it explained why Mr. Pemberton had become so desperate to end his involvement and seek protection from the authorities. "Tom," Miss Marple said carefully, "do you know where these weapons might have been taken?" "I'm not certain, miss, but I heard Mr. Pemberton mention addresses in London and Birmingham, places where the crates were to be delivered. He had a notebook where he wrote down all the details. Do you know what happened to this notebook?" Tom looked around nervously before answering. "That's part of what I wanted to tell you, miss. The day before Mr. Pemberton died, I saw him putting papers into a metal box. He locked it and hid it somewhere in the station. I think he was creating a record of everything in case something happened to him." Miss Marple felt a surge of excitement. If Pemberton had indeed hidden evidence of the weapons trafficking, it could provide the key to understanding not only his murder, but the entire criminal operation. "Do you have any idea where he might have hidden this box?" "I've been thinking about that, miss. Mr. Pemberton was a very methodical man, and he knew the station better than anyone. If I had to guess, I'd say he hid it somewhere in the signal box. It's the one place that's always locked and that only he had regular access to." Miss Marple made a mental note to suggest this possibility to Inspector Slack. "Tom, why didn't you mention this to the inspector when he interviewed you?" The young man's face flushed with shame. "I was frightened, miss. Frightened of what might happen if people knew how much I'd seen and heard. My mother's been so ill and I need this job. I thought maybe if I kept quiet, the whole business would just fade away. But Mr. Pemberton's death changed things." "Yes, miss. I keep thinking that if I'd spoken up sooner, maybe he'd still be alive. Maybe if the authorities had known about the weapons, they could have protected him." Miss Marple reached over and patted Tommy. After Tom departed, Miss Marple sat alone with her thoughts, trying to piece together the full scope of the criminal operation. The Phantom trains had clearly evolved from a simple smuggling scheme into something far more dangerous. The 7-minute gaps in the official timetable had been used to transport weapons, probably to criminal organisations in major cities. She reached for her telephone and dialed Inspector Slack's number. Despite the late hour, she felt this information was too important to wait until morning. "Inspector," she said when he answered, "I've just had a visit from Tom Bradley, and I think you need to hear what he's told me immediately." 20 minutes later, Inspector Slack sat in her sitting room, furiously taking notes as she recounted Tom's revelations about the weapons trafficking and the hidden evidence box. "Weapons," he muttered grimly. "That explains why Pemberton was so frightened in his final weeks. If he discovered he was helping to arm criminals, it would have terrified him." "And it provides an even stronger motive for murder," Miss Marple observed. "If this operation was supplying weapons to dangerous people, they wouldn't hesitate to kill someone who threatened to expose them." Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a snap. "We need to search that signal box immediately. If Pemberton really did hide evidence there, it could blow this case wide open. There's something else to consider, Inspector. If Tom is correct about the scope of this operation, then Mr. Pemberton's murder may not have been committed by one of the local conspirators at all. Someone from outside St. Mary Mead, someone with much more at stake, might have come here specifically to eliminate him." The inspector paused in his preparations to leave. "You mean someone from the criminal organisation receiving the weapons?" "It's possible. The sophisticated nature of the poison, the precise timing of the murder, the manipulation of the timepieces, these all suggest someone with considerable criminal experience, not a desperate local person acting in panic." Inspector Slack considered this possibility. But the killer would still have needed inside knowledge of the station's operations and Pemberton's routines. "True," Miss Marple agreed, "which suggests either a very well-informed outsider or a local person acting on orders from above." As Inspector Slack prepared to organise the search of the signal box, Miss Marple reflected on how the discovery of the weapons trafficking had changed her understanding of the case. The 7 minutes that had been missing from the official timetable represented far more than simple scheduling irregularities. They had created a window of opportunity for activities that threatened public safety on a much larger scale. The murder of Mr. Pemberton was beginning to look less like a crime of passion, committed by a frightened conspirator, and more like a calculated elimination carried out by professional criminals. If this were true, then the residents of St. Mary Mead had been unwitting participants in something far more dangerous than they had realised. Miss Marple had a growing sense that the solution to this mystery lay not just in identifying the killer, but in understanding the full extent of the criminal network that had been operating through their quiet village station. The missing 7 minutes had concealed activities that reached far beyond the boundaries of St. Mary Mead, and the truth, when it finally emerged, would likely shock everyone involved. The precision that had characterised both the Phantom Train operation and Pemberton's murder suggested a level of criminal sophistication that demanded serious attention from the authorities. Miss Marple suspected that before this case was closed, Inspector Slack would need assistance from his colleagues in London to fully unravel the web of criminal activity that had cost Harold Pemberton his life. Chapter 7. A Schedule of Deception. The search of the signal box took place at dawn, with Inspector Slack accompanied by 2 constables from the county police. Miss Marple, having requested permission to observe, watched from the platform as they carefully examined every inch of the small building that controlled the railway signals for St. Mary Mead Station. The signal box was a cramped but well-organised space, filled with the mechanical apparatus that managed train movements through the station. Tom Bradley had been correct in his assessment that it was a place only Mr. Pemberton would have had regular access to, as the operation of the signals required specialised knowledge and authority. After nearly an hour of searching, one of the constables called out from behind the main signal lever assembly, "Inspector, I think I've found something." Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped in oiled cloth, was indeed a metal strongbox of the type used to protect important documents from fire and moisture. Inspector Slack carefully extracted it and found it secured with a small but sturdy lock. "We'll need to open this properly at the station," he announced. But Miss Marple could see the excitement in his expression. The box was precisely what Tom Bradley had described, and its careful concealment suggested contents of considerable importance. An hour later, in the privacy of the village police station, Inspector Slack used a locksmith's tools to open the strongbox. Inside, they found a treasure trove of evidence that exceeded even Miss Marple's expectations. The box contained a detailed ledger documenting every Phantom Train operation over the past 6 months, complete with dates, times, cargo descriptions and payment records. There were photographs of suspicious activities at the station, copies of correspondence with criminal contacts, and most damning of all, a list of weapon shipments with their destinations clearly marked. "Good heavens," Inspector Slack muttered as he examined the contents. Pemberton documented everything. Rifles, ammunition, even explosives, all transported through our quiet little station. Miss Marple studied one of the photographs, which showed men loading unmarked crates under cover of darkness. He was building a case against his own operation. These records would have been sufficient to prosecute everyone involved. But it was the final document in the box that proved most revealing. A letter written in Pemberton's hand, dated just 3 days before his death, and addressed, "To whom it may concern." Inspector Slack read it aloud. "I can no longer continue my participation in activities that endanger public safety. What began as simple smuggling has evolved into weapons trafficking that could result in serious harm to innocent people. I have documented everything, and intend to present this evidence to the railway authorities and police. I understand this decision may place me in personal danger, but I cannot live with the knowledge of what I have enabled." "A confession and a warning," Miss Marple observed. "He knew his life was at risk." The letter continued with specific details about the criminal organisation behind the weapons trafficking. It named contacts in London and Birmingham, described payment methods, and most significantly, identified which local railway employees had been knowingly involved versus those who had been manipulated or deceived. According to this, Inspector Slack said, consulting the letter, Tom Bradley was largely innocent, mainly used for manual labour without full knowledge of what he was handling. Mrs. Fletcher, however, was a key coordinator, using her shop as a front for receiving payments and her supposed visits to her sister as cover for meetings with criminal contacts. Miss Marple felt pieces of the puzzle continuing to fall into place. What does he say about Mr. Morrison and Mr. Blackwood? Morrison was apparently recruited because of his desperate financial situation, but became increasingly uncomfortable as the operation escalated. Blackwood, on the other hand, was described as a willing participant who actively helped organise the phantom train schedules. The inspector turned to the final page of the letter. But here's the most interesting part. Pemberton mentions receiving threats from someone he calls the coordinator, someone who had been managing the entire operation from outside St. Mary Mead. An outsider? Miss Marple asked with interest. According to this, yes. Someone with extensive criminal connections who had established similar operations at multiple railway stations across the country. Pemberton writes that this person had become increasingly violent in their threats as he attempted to withdraw from the operation. Miss Marple considered this revelation carefully. It supports the theory that Mr. Pemberton's murder was carried out by someone with professional criminal experience rather than a panicked local conspirator. Inspector Slack gathered the documents carefully. There's enough evidence here to make multiple arrests, but we need to move quickly. If word gets out about what we've found, they may attempt to eliminate other potential witnesses. What sort of trap did you have in mind? Miss Marple moved to the window and looked out at the railway station, where the afternoon activities were proceeding with deceptive normalcy. Someone who has invested months in establishing this operation won't simply abandon it because of Mr. Pemberton's death. They'll want to ensure that all evidence and witnesses are eliminated. She turned back to Inspector Slack. If we could somehow signal that one of the local conspirators has additional evidence, or is planning to confess, it might draw the coordinator into the open. The inspector looked intrigued but cautious. That would be quite dangerous for whoever acted as bait. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, but consider this. The coordinator has already committed murder to protect their operation. If we don't act decisively, they may kill again to ensure their security. Their discussion was interrupted by a commotion outside the police station. Through the window, they could see Mrs. Fletcher approaching at a rapid pace, her face flushed with apparent agitation. "Inspector Slack," she called as she burst through the door. "I must speak with you immediately. It's about Harold Pemberton's death. I know who killed him." Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged glances. The timing of Mrs. Fletcher's sudden desire to confess seemed remarkably convenient, given what they had just discovered in Pemberton's hidden strongbox. "Please sit down, Mrs. Fletcher," Inspector Slack said calmly. "What did you want to tell me?" The woman appeared genuinely distraught, wringing her hands as she spoke. "I've been carrying this burden for days, and I can't stand it anymore. I was involved in Harold's business arrangements, I admit that, but I never intended for anyone to be hurt." "What sort of business arrangements?" the inspector asked, though he already knew much of the answer. "The special trains," Mrs. Fletcher replied. "I helped coordinate shipments for certain clients. Harold said it was just avoiding some bureaucratic regulations, helping people transport goods without excessive paperwork." Miss Marple observed the woman's demeanour carefully. Her distress appeared genuine, but there was something calculated about her timing and her choice of words. "When did you learn that the operation involved more than simple bureaucratic avoidance?" Inspector Slack inquired. Mrs. Fletcher's face crumpled. "About 2 weeks ago, I discovered what we were really transporting. Harold showed me some photographs he'd taken, evidence of weapons being loaded onto our trains. I was horrified." "What did you do with this information?" "I demanded that we stop immediately. I told Harold I wouldn't be part of anything that dangerous, but he said it wasn't that simple, that there were people involved who wouldn't let us just walk away." Inspector Slack leaned forward. "What people, Mrs. Fletcher?" Harold called them the London Connection. He said they had operations at railway stations all over the country, and that they'd made it clear what would happen to anyone who tried to expose them. Mrs. Fletcher dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "The morning Harold died, I went to his office to plead with him one more time to find a way out. But he said he'd already made his decision and was going to the authorities regardless of the consequences." Miss Marple felt a chill of recognition. Mrs. Fletcher's account placed her in Pemberton's office during the crucial time period when the poison could have been administered. Combined with her admitted involvement in the criminal operation and her access to the stationery used for the threatening letters, she was emerging as the most likely suspect for the murder itself. But Miss Marple also sensed that Mrs. Fletcher's sudden confession might be motivated by more than guilt. If the woman had learned about the discovery of Pemberton's hidden evidence, she might be attempting to control the narrative by admitting to her involvement while denying the murder. The question was whether Mrs. Fletcher was the coordinator mentioned in Pemberton's letter, or whether she was another pawn in a larger game who had finally realised the true scope of what she had become involved in. Chapter 8. The Signal Box Confession. The revelation that Mrs. Fletcher had been in Mr. Pemberton's office during the crucial time period sent a ripple of tension through the small police station. Inspector Slack asked her to wait in the adjacent room, while he conferred privately with Miss Marple about this unexpected development. "Her timing is remarkably convenient," Miss Marple observed quietly. "She confesses to involvement in the weapons trafficking just as we discover evidence that could implicate her in murder." "My thoughts exactly," Inspector Slack agreed, "but we need to be careful. If she really is just another victim of this coordinator's manipulation, we don't want to let the real killer escape while we focus on her." Their consultation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the window, they could see Tom Bradley running toward the police station, his face pale with obvious distress. "Inspector," he called as he burst through the door, "you need to come to the signal box immediately. There's been an accident." The three of them hurried to the railway station, where they found a small crowd gathered around the signal box. Mr. Morrison, the conductor, was sitting on the platform steps with blood on his forehead, while Dr. Haydock knelt beside him providing medical attention. "What happened?" Inspector Slack demanded. Tom Bradley, still breathing heavily from his run, explained, "I was checking the signals for the afternoon express when I heard shouting from inside the box. When I got there, I found Mr. Morrison on the floor, apparently struck by one of the signal levers." Dr. Haydock looked up from his examination. "He has a nasty gash on his head, but he'll be all right. The question is whether this was truly an accident." Inspector Slack climbed the steps to examine the signal box. Inside, the mechanical apparatus appeared to have been disturbed, with several levers in positions that didn't correspond to the current train schedule. Miss Marple followed him into the cramped space, noting the blood stain on one of the heavy metal levers. "Inspector, look at this," she said, pointing to scratches in the wooden floor near where Pemberton's strongbox had been hidden. "Someone has been digging here recently." After we found the evidence box this morning, Inspector Slack realised, someone came looking for it. They climbed back down to where Dr. Haydock was still tending to Morrison's injury. The conductor was conscious now, though clearly shaken by his experience. "Mr. Morrison," Miss Marple said gently, "can you tell us what happened in the signal box?" Morrison touched his bandaged head gingerly. "I went there to check something about the afternoon train schedule. I thought I heard someone inside, but when I called out, there was no answer. I climbed up to investigate and found someone going through the equipment where you found that box this morning." "Could you see who it was?" Inspector Slack asked. "Not clearly. They were wearing dark clothes and had their back to me. When they heard me coming up the steps, they grabbed one of the signal levers and swung it at my head. I don't remember anything after that." Miss Marple exchanged glances with Inspector Slack. Someone had indeed been searching for additional evidence, confirming that the coordinator was still in the area and actively trying to eliminate traces of the criminal operation. "Mr. Morrison," she continued, "why did you go to the signal box in the first place? What made you think to check the train schedule there?" Morrison looked uncomfortable. "I received a message this morning, supposedly from the new station master, asking me to verify some schedule discrepancies. The message said there might be additional documentation stored in the signal box." "What sort of message?" Inspector Slack inquired. "A note slipped under my door at home. It was typed, not handwritten, and it seemed official enough. But now I'm wondering if someone was using me to discover whether you'd found everything when you searched the box." Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting again. "Do you still have this note?" Morrison nodded and carefully withdrew a folded paper from his jacket pocket. The note was indeed typed on official railway stationery, and bore the appearance of legitimate correspondence. Inspector Slack examined it closely. "This paper is the same type used for internal railway communications, but the typing style doesn't match other official documents I've seen." "Someone with access to railway stationery, but not necessarily an official position," Miss Marple observed, "or someone who wanted to create that impression." Their investigation was interrupted by Dr. Haydock, who had finished treating Morrison's injury. "He should rest for the remainder of the day, but there's no serious damage. However, I'm concerned about the pattern of violence we're seeing." "What do you mean, Doctor?" Miss Marple asked. "First Mr. Pemberton's carefully planned murder, now this attack on Mr. Morrison. Someone is becoming increasingly desperate and willing to use violence to protect their interests." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "Which means we need to resolve this case quickly before anyone else gets hurt." "As they prepared to escort Morrison, miss, but when I found Mr. Morrison, I thought I saw someone running away from the station toward the village. Just a glimpse, mind you, but they seemed to be moving with purpose." "Could you tell anything about this person?" Inspector Slack inquired. "Not much, sir. Medium height, wearing a dark coat. They disappeared behind Fletcher's shop before I could get a better look." Miss Marple felt a chill of realization. Mrs. Fletcher had been in the police station confessing her involvement in the criminal operation at the exact time someone was attacking Morrison in the signal box. Either she had an accomplice, or the real coordinator was still operating freely while using her confession as a distraction. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I think we need to return to the police station immediately. If Mrs. Fletcher has been providing us with a carefully crafted confession, while someone else was destroying evidence, we may have been looking in the wrong direction entirely." They hurried back to the police station, only to discover that Mrs. Fletcher was no longer in the room where they had left her. The constable on duty explained that she had asked to use the lavatory and had simply never returned. "She's fled," Inspector Slack said grimly, which suggests either guilt or fear that her usefulness to the real coordinator has ended. Miss Marple moved to the window that overlooked the main street of the village. In the distance she could see a figure walking rapidly toward the railway station, carrying what appeared to be a travelling case. "Inspector," she said urgently, "I believe we're about to witness the coordinator's departure. If we don't act now, we'll lose our chance to apprehend the person really responsible for Mr. Pemberton's murder." The figure disappeared into the station building just as the afternoon express began to approach from the distance. Inspector Slack gathered his constables, and they rushed toward the railway station, with Miss Marple following despite his protests about her safety. As they reached the platform, the London Express was pulling into the station with its usual thunder of steam and screech of brakes. Several passengers were already positioned to board, and Miss Marple realised that if the coordinator managed to get on that train, they would disappear into the anonymity of London's vast railway network. The next few minutes would determine whether Harold Pemberton's killer would escape justice or finally face the consequences of their carefully planned crime. Miss Marple had a growing certainty about the identity of the real murderer, but proving it would require catching them before they could complete their escape. Chapter 9. Truth on the Railway Line. As the London Express came to a complete stop at St. Mary Mead Station, Miss Marple found herself scanning the platform with the keen eye of someone who had spent a lifetime observing human behaviour. The usual complement of passengers was preparing to board, but among them she spotted a figure that made her heart race with recognition. Tom Bradley stood near the luggage car, ostensibly performing his duties as porter, but his movements were hurried and nervous. In his hand was a small travelling case that Miss Marple had not seen him carrying during their earlier conversations at the signal box. "Inspector," she said quietly, touching Inspector Slack's arm, "I believe we've been looking at this case from entirely the wrong perspective." Before Inspector Slack could respond, Miss Marple stepped forward onto the platform. "Tom," she called in her most gentle voice, "might I have a word with you before the train departs?" The young man froze, his hand tightening on the travelling case. For a moment Miss Marple thought he might simply ignore her and board the train, but something in her tone seemed to reach him. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice barely audible above the hiss of steam from the locomotive, "I was just checking the cargo manifest." "Of course you were, dear," Miss Marple replied, moving closer, "though I notice you have a travelling case with you. Are you planning a journey?" Tom's face had gone very pale, and Miss Marple could see the perspiration on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air. "My mother," he said desperately. "She's taken a turn for the worse. I need to get to London for a specialist." Inspector Slack had now joined them, along with his constables, though they maintained a respectful distance. Miss Marple could sense the young man's growing panic, and she knew that any sudden movement might cause him to do something desperate. "Tom," she said gently, "I think we both know that's not true. Your mother is resting comfortably at home, and Haydock saw her just yesterday. She's actually been improving lately, hasn't she?" The young man's shoulders sagged, and Miss Marple saw tears beginning to form in his eyes. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I never meant for any of this to happen. It was supposed to be simple, just helping people transport goods without all the bureaucratic nonsense. But it became much more complicated than that, didn't it?" Miss Marple continued in her most understanding tone. "When did you realise that you weren't just helping with smuggling, but with something much more dangerous?" Tom glanced around at the gathered crowd, his eyes desperate. "When I saw the weapons," he admitted. "Real weapons, not just stolen goods or contraband. I tried to tell Mr. Pemberton that we needed to stop, but he said it was too late, that we were all in too deep." Inspector Slack stepped forward carefully. "Tom, we found Mr. Pemberton's records. We know about the weapons trafficking and the criminal organisation behind it, but we also know that you weren't the coordinator of this operation." "Wasn't I?" Tom laughed bitterly. "You think because I'm young and seem innocent that I couldn't have been running the whole thing? That's exactly what made it work so well." Miss Marple felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The young porter, with his earnest demeanour and financial desperation, had been the perfect cover for a sophisticated criminal operation. Who would suspect someone so obviously struggling to pay his mother's medical bills? "You used your position at the station to coordinate everything," she said with dawning understanding. "You had access to all the schedules, all the facilities, and the trust of everyone involved. Mr. Pemberton thought he was the mastermind, but you were actually managing the entire operation." Tom nodded miserably. "It started when I was contacted by people from London who knew about my mother's medical expenses. They offered me a way to earn extra money, and at first it really was just helping people avoid paperwork, but gradually they wanted me to do more. And when Mr. Pemberton became suspicious and started investigating, I tried to convince him that everything was legitimate, but he'd grown paranoid. He started taking photographs, keeping records, threatening to go to the authorities." Tom's voice broke. "I pleaded with him to reconsider, told him about my mother, but he said he couldn't live with what we'd become involved in." Inspector Slack moved closer, his hand resting on his truncheon. "So you killed him to prevent him from exposing the operation?" "I never wanted to kill anyone," Tom cried out. "But the people in London made it clear what would happen to me and my mother if Pemberton talked. They said they had contacts everywhere, that there would be nowhere we could hide." Miss Marple saw the young man's hand move toward his jacket pocket, and realised with alarm that he might be armed. "Tom," she said firmly, "whatever threats were made against you, killing Mr. Pemberton has only made things worse. The authorities will protect you and your mother if you cooperate with them." "You don't understand," Tom repeated, his voice rising. "These people don't make idle threats. They've killed before, and they'll kill again. Pemberton's death was supposed to end the investigation, but instead it's brought more attention. Which is why you attacked Mr. Morrison in the signal box, Inspector Slack realised. You were trying to recover any evidence that might have been missed. Tom nodded desperately. I thought there might be more hidden documents, more evidence that could connect me to the organisation. But when Morrison interrupted me, I panicked. The conductor of the London Express appeared at the carriage door, checking his watch impatiently. "All aboard!" he called. "Departure in 2 minutes!" Tom looked longingly at the train, his means of escape so tantalisingly close. "I can't go to prison," he said desperately. "My mother needs me. The medical bills, the treatments, she'll die without proper care." Miss Marple felt her heart go out to the young man despite his crimes. The love for his mother that had driven him to become involved in the criminal operation was genuine, even if his methods had been terribly wrong. "Tom," she said gently, "your mother would rather have you alive and honest than free and criminal. The organisation that threatened you will abandon you the moment you're no longer useful to them. Your only real protection is to tell the authorities everything you know." For a moment the young man wavered, his gaze moving between the waiting train and the faces surrounding him. Miss Marple could see the internal struggle playing out across his features quietly. "I put poison in his afternoon tea because I was afraid of what would happen if he exposed our operation. God help me, I murdered a decent man because I was too much of a coward to find another way." Inspector Slack stepped forward and placed the handcuffs on Tom's wrists with surprising gentleness. "Tom Bradley, I arrest you for the murder of Harold Pemberton. You're not obliged to say anything unless you wish to do so, but whatever you say will be taken down in writing and may be given in evidence." As they led Tom away from the platform, Miss Marple watched the London Express pull out of the station right on schedule. The 7-minute window that had made the phantom train operation possible was finally closing, taking with it the last remnants of the deception that had cost Harold Pemberton his life. The truth had emerged not through dramatic revelation, but through the quiet persistence of investigation and the ultimate breakdown of a young man who had found himself trapped in circumstances far beyond his ability to control. The railway line that had carried so many secrets would now carry Tom Bradley toward whatever justice awaited him, while the station at St. Mary Mead began the slow process of returning to honest operation. Chapter 10. Justice arrives on time. 3 months had passed since Tom Bradley's arrest, and the autumn air carried a crisp clarity that seemed to reflect the restoration of order to St. Mary Mead Station. Miss Marple stood on the platform, watching as the new station master, Mr. Hartwell, efficiently managed the morning departures with a precision that would have pleased even Harold Pemberton. The trial had concluded the previous week, with Tom Bradley receiving a sentence of 15 years for murder, reduced from life imprisonment due to the extenuating circumstances of his mother's illness and the coercion he had faced from the criminal organisation. His confession had provided authorities with sufficient information to dismantle similar operations at railway stations across 3 counties. Inspector Slack approached her on the platform, looking considerably more satisfied than he had during the investigation. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with genuine warmth, "I wanted to thank you again for your assistance in this case. Without your insights, we might never have uncovered the true scope of the operation." "The truth has a way of emerging eventually, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, "though I confess I feel great sadness for young Tom. His love for his mother led him down a path that ultimately destroyed both their lives. Mrs. Bradley had passed away 2 weeks after her son's arrest, the shock of his confession and imprisonment proving too much for her already fragile health. The irony was not lost on anyone that Tom's desperate efforts to save her had ultimately hastened her demise. "What news of the others involved?" Miss Marple inquired. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. "Mrs. Fletcher received 2 years for her role in the smuggling operation, though her cooperation with the investigation earned her a reduced sentence. She's already been released and has moved to live with her sister in Paddington, as she always claimed to be doing." "And Mr. Morrison?" 6 months, suspended in recognition of his limited involvement and his assistance in providing evidence against the London contacts. He's been transferred to a different railway line and seems to be making a fresh start. Mr. Blackwood. Dismissed from railway service but avoided prosecution by providing detailed testimony about the technical aspects of the operation. He's found work as a clerk in the next village. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The justice system had attempted to balance punishment with mercy, recognising that not all the conspirators had been equally culpable in the escalation to violence. Dr. Haydock joined them on the platform, carrying his medical bag and preparing to catch the morning train to London for a medical conference. "Miss Marple, Inspector," he greeted them. "Any final thoughts on our recent excitement?" "I've been reflecting on how a simple act of compassion became corrupted into something so destructive," Miss Marple replied. "Tom's desire to help his mother was admirable, but when he chose illegal means to achieve that end, he opened the door to increasingly serious crimes." "The phantom trains themselves were ingenious," Dr. Haydock observed, using the 7-minute discrepancy between the station clock and real time to create windows of unofficial activity. It might have continued indefinitely if not for Pemberton's crisis of conscience. Inspector Slack looked out at the railway tracks stretching toward London. The really troubling aspect is how many people were drawn into the conspiracy without fully understanding what they were becoming part of. Tom Bradley exploited their trust and their financial vulnerabilities to build his network. "That's often how such operations succeed," Miss Marple agreed. "They begin with small compromises and gradually escalate until people find themselves trapped in situations they never intended to enter." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the London Express, running precisely on schedule according to the newly corrected station clock. Miss Marple watched as passengers boarded and departed with the routine efficiency that had been restored to the station's operations. "The new station master seems competent," she observed. "Mr. Hartwell comes with excellent references and a reputation for absolute honesty," Inspector Slack confirmed. The railway authorities were determined to ensure there could be no repetition of the recent problems. As the train departed, Miss Marple reflected on the lessons learned from the case. The precision and reliability of the railway system, which should have been pillars of public trust, had been corrupted by greed and desperation. The 7-minute window that had enabled the phantom trains represented not just a gap in time, but a failure of oversight that had allowed criminal activity to flourish. "I understand the railway authorities have implemented new security measures," she mentioned. "Indeed," Inspector Slack replied. "Regular unannounced inspections, stricter accounting procedures, and background checks for all personnel with access to scheduling information. They're determined that St. Mary Mead will never again serve as a conduit for criminal activity." Dr. Haydock prepared to board the next train, but paused to make a final observation. "What strikes me most about this case is how Tom Bradley's youth and apparent innocence made him the perfect coordinator for the operation. No one suspected that someone so obviously struggling financially could be the mastermind behind such a sophisticated scheme." "That's precisely what made him so effective," Miss Marple agreed. "He appeared to be merely another victim of circumstances, when in reality he was orchestrating the entire deception." After Dr. Haydock departed and Inspector Slack returned to his duties, Miss Marple remained on the platform for a few more minutes, observing the restored normalcy of the station's operations. The phantom trains were gone, the 7-minute window of deception had been closed, and the railway ran according to its published schedule. Yet she knew that somewhere else, at other stations and in other communities, similar schemes might be developing. The combination of financial desperation and criminal opportunity that had made the St. Mary Mead operation possible existed wherever people struggled to make ends meet and where oversight was insufficient to prevent abuse. As she finally left the platform and walked back toward the village, Miss Marple reflected on the complex nature of justice. Tom Bradley would serve his sentence and hopefully emerge as a wiser man, though he would carry the weight of Harold Pemberton's death for the rest of his life. The other conspirators would attempt to rebuild their lives with varying degrees of success. The railway system itself had been strengthened by the exposure of its vulnerabilities, making future criminal exploitation more difficult. In that sense, Harold Pemberton's death had not been entirely in vain. though Miss Marple knew that was small comfort to those who had known and respected the deceased station master. The case had reminded her once again that evil often wore a familiar face, and that the most dangerous criminals were sometimes those who seemed least capable of serious wrongdoing. Tom Bradley's youth and apparent devotion to his mother had provided perfect camouflage for activities that had ultimately endangered public safety on a scale none of the local conspirators had imagined. As she reached her cottage and settled into her garden chair with the morning newspaper, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of satisfaction that justice had been served, however imperfectly. The 7-minute window that had enabled so much deception was finally closed, and the trains of St. Mary Mead once again ran exactly on time. The station clock, she noted with approval, now showed the correct time, its hands moving in honest synchronization with the passage of real minutes